Good day. My name is Charles Kidegochaya and I'm a lecturer at Gibbs. I'll be taking you through sustainable development. Now, the concept of sustainable development means development that can persist over a long time. Hence, it becomes sustainable. It is not a short-term concept or happening, but it's something that will occur for a very long time. So development which is not sustainable is development which will only last a short time. In principle, an optimal policy would seek to maintain acceptable rates of growth of incomes without depleting national capital stock or the natural environmental asset stock. So this statement simply means that economic development and growth in per capita incomes are not necessarily the same thing. You can have economic growth, but if there is depletion or there is misuse of natural assets, then you do not have sustainable development. In other words, economic development is actually only a prerequisite for having sustainable development. This diagram depicts the concept that for you to have sustainable development, several aspects need to come into play. You need to have the economy performing well, that is economic growth. You need to have environmental management, good environmental management, and also societal aspects have to be in good form. When all those three pillars combine, you will be moving towards sustainable development. Again, these diagrams depict the idea that economic growth is only but a necessary condition for economic development. Okay, but it is not sufficient. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. For sufficiency, you will then need things like other developments to happen. There should be health, there should be education, there should be equitable distribution of incomes for you to have sustainable development. We shall look at that in greater detail. Now, sustainable development, for it to be properly defined, needs to consider some of these points. It is a concept which has to capture long-term well-being, not only short-term well-being, but long-term well-being of persons in a country. It must be comprehensive. In other words, it must cover all the core issues of decision making. It is not only a partial solution to problems. It should cover all aspects for you to have a sustainable development. In other words, all the other parts are linked to the others. A program which aims to promote sustainable development must recognize the links and interdependencies, especially between humans and the biophysical foundations for life. Here it speaks about ecosystems being in place. You do not have to damage the environments because we also depend on fauna and flora, living and non-living things around us. So it's an ecosystem which has to be managed for us to also live here in the long term. Sustainable development must also recognize that there are some limits which you cannot violate. Right? There are some inviolable limits, whereas you have also opportunities to create, innovate. So we are working within a bounded sphere where we can only grow, have economic growth or profitability of so much. But without proper management, we begin to actually damage some other things. We can damage the environment. So there are limits to whatever we do. We work with it with constraints. Also, sustainable development is not, it's an open-ended process. It is continuously changing, continuously improving. It's not static. Right? So you need to take cognizance of the dynamism of the factors involved in sustainable development. Now this schema tries to depict some of the challenges or some of the factors you need to consider when you're going to boast of sustainable development. Essentially, they're in three dimensions. There is the health aspect, there is the education aspect, and the living standards aspect. This is what is captured in the Human Development Index, which has been developed by the United Nations. We shall go into detail to discuss these components. Now, the Human Development Index, like I already said, includes health issues, education, living standards, and these can be measured using some metrics. Metrics essentially are substantive measures which you can actually show and say we have covered so much ground, okay, pertaining to those elements which we've already discussed. So when you begin to now compare countries, then you know who is doing better than the others. You give them numbers and figures. Then you can do bar charts and comparative studies between countries. So life expectancy comes out as a number. The number of years you expect people to live in a country is an indicator of the state of health care. The better the healthcare systems, the longer the higher the life expectancies you should expect, which you can see between poorer and wealthier countries. Those in wealthier countries tend to live longer because of the better healthcare systems. Okay, and as for education, you look at the average years of education. How many years do people in a country study or go to school? Obviously, the higher the number of years, the better. Which means that the higher the literacy levels. And then if there's literacy and knowledge, it's a knowledge-based economy, you will have better living standards, and then there's greater productivity as well. Then the expected years of schooling, yes, that can be compared. The gross national income per capita incomes, meaning that if you have national income which is known, for example, could it be like billions, several billions, divide that by the number of people in a country, then on average you expect everyone to have a certain amount of money from that national income. This is an indicator, broadly speaking, on how the levels of income in a country. Now, using per capita income, you are able to compare different countries. Obviously, countries which are doing better have higher national per capita incomes. Okay, on a person-by-person basis, they have higher per capita incomes. Now, some of the players the institutions in sustainable development have been listed here. These include the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, the World Trade Organization, which deals with trade, controlling rules and regulations pertaining to trade, fair trade, and things like that. The IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, they lend money, it's a bank, in fact. The World Bank, which is a development bank, and they focus on longer term loans and support to have development projects going on in third world countries especially. Then you have the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. So in any developing country, you will have these organizations playing a part in development. The question of whether or to what extent they help in development and in particular sustainable development is another question entirely and subject to debate. Another important organization when it comes to discussing sustainable development is the World Trade Organization. Now, traditionally, the World Trade Organization, which is the WTO, has been concerned with regulations pertaining to dumping and setting standards for international trade, especially between countries. Dumping, as you know, has to do with a country that will supply commodities in another destination, but at lower prices, and as a result, it will swamp the local enterprises. This is not considered to be fair in any way. Recently, the WTO has also refocused and taken into account the small, medium, and micro enterprises. These are the small companies or the small businesses that employ few people and have lower turnover, but collectively are very important when you're discussing sustainable development. So it was a wise move to take account of the SMMEs as well. In collaboration with the International Chamber of Commerce, the WTO provides a platform where small, medium, and micro enterprises can propose innovative solutions and some practical ideas on how to address their problems. In addition to that, the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, can also receive proposals pertaining to businesses. So if you have a business proposal, you can channel it through the International Chamber of Commerce, and if it's a viable option or a viable enterprise, you can get support from them. This is a move towards ensuring that employment happens in less privileged areas as well. We also need to look at another actor or player in issues pertaining to sustainable development, and that is the World Fair Trade Organization. Now, they will be dealing more with fair trade, and as we know, fair trade is a trading partnership based on transparency, respect, and greater equity or greater even distribution in international trade. It contributes to sustainable development by securing the rights of marginalized producers and workers. In other words, those very unfortunate workers on the fringes in other countries, in the rural communities who don't have access to certain commodities or certain rights. They have fewer privileges, their voices don't get heard, but the WFTO tries to give them a voice so that their issues can also be understood and heard. Now, fair trade is not just trading, but it aims to ensure that you do not ignore planet and people. You remember that there is this concept of the 3Ps, where there is an interconnectedness between people, planet, and profit. So much so that if you are to ignore planet and people, eventually this will also harm profitability of the business. So there's an interconnectedness between all these aspects of human endeavor. One does not supersede the other. Fair trade also aims to promote good climatic management, gender equality, and justice. And above all that, it also fights poverty. Now, some of the principles of fair trade that leads to sustainable development are the following. Firstly, the first principle is that it should ensure that poverty will be reduced. It should strive to reduce poverty in whatever form it appears in. The second principle is that it ensures that there is accountability to all its stakeholders. In other words, there should be transparency, its methods should be well known, and members who subscribe to the WTO should also ensure that they are transparent and they're open to auditing as well. This World Fair Trade Organization also encourages that contracts and commitments are honored in a timely manner. Sometimes, if you're a farmer in a rural setting, you may supply your commodities because you cannot keep them, you have no storage, you have no silos, you supply your commodities, your farm produce, but payment may be delayed for too long, and this leads you to suffer, makes you suffer, and also sometimes the business will also suffer because of that. So World Fair Trade Organization tries to push those buyers, those large-scale buyers, to pay as early as possible in order to minimize the suffering of the rural communities. Also, not only timely payment, there should also be fair payment. A fair wage should be paid, the right amount. I give the idea or the example of the cocoa farmers whose product ends up as chocolate. But a bar of chocolate is very expensive, whereas the cocoa pod is very, very cheap. So the question is that margin, the price gap, how come the gap is so big in terms of prices? The other fair trade principles include the non-usage of child labor. In some countries, you may find that children work long hours, they work in factories, but in advanced countries, that may not be allowed. And in fact, there is enforceability to make sure that that does not happen. There should also be non-discrimination. When you speak of fair trade principles, there should be non-discrimination on the basis of gender, race, religion, and any other factors. Another principle is that of health and safety at work. There should be measures, you should be provided with the right equipment to ensure that you are safe, boots, helmets, and whatever else you need to make sure that they minimize harm at factories. Okay, and if possible, workers should be insured. There should be compensation upon injury or death. The eighth principle is the undertaking by the World Free Trade Organization to provide accurate information to all those concerned. So they filter, they make sure that they provide the correct information and create awareness to all the stakeholders, especially those who would not otherwise have had access. Then the next principle of fair trade is that they try to encourage local empowerment of the rural folk or rural communities. You do this by buying from them, buy locally, use local raw materials rather than getting supplies from elsewhere. So if you set up in another destination, in a new country, the idea is that you should use materials that are found there so that you create employment as well. Now, with regard to some of these institutions, they have challenges, and some of them have made progress towards remedying these challenges. One of them is that of a coordinated effort from donors of aid. In the past, there has been disjointed work being done, and there was no coordination of donor activities, so that sometimes they'll be duplicating their efforts, sometimes they'll be focusing in the wrong places or the wrong countries, or countries where there's already some ongoing help and so on. So there is no centrally coordinated effort, or there has not been great centrally coordinated effort to know what the left hand is doing and what the right hand is doing. So for the sake of efficiency, if you have coordinated efforts, abundance of information of the projects that are ongoing, then the aid can be directed to more urgent use. And also, the other point is the means for disbursing aid have been developed in recent years. Mechanisms have been put in place on how much aid should go and where it should go. So there is improvement. So there's ongoing improvement, and this represents a step in the right direction. There is also the question of capacity within developing countries. You cannot just pump aid without doing some groundwork. You cannot just donate without going to the ground, seeing how the aid is being used, making sure that there is capacity. You have project managers on the ground, you have engineers, and so on. Okay, donating aid and leaving it like that is not enough to ensure that the aid gets through to those who the aid is supposed to be directed to. Okay. Also, since environmental issues are very important when you're talking about sustainable development, you must also ensure that whatever you do or whatever programs you put in place, there is always a component of environmental impact assessments, EIAs, to make sure that you do not degrade the environment, the projects do not destroy wildlife, and so on. So the heritage which we have needs to be passed on to future generations as well. Now, a great deal of so many people live in the rural sector, and in developing countries, urbanization is lower. So there is also need to understand where people live, how they live, what resources they have access to, how do they have sustainable livelihoods, right? So some models have been developed in the past where they look at both the urban sector and also the rural sector. They make the distinction between urban livelihood and rural livelihoods. Books and articles that have been researched have been mainly from Europe, where the level of urbanization is much higher, and the challenges for sustainable urban livelihoods is rather different. But here in Africa and in third world countries, we live in environments where the rural population is very large, and we also have very large informal sectors. So we need to understand what these people have access to, okay, in terms of resources, how do they live, and how do they sustain themselves. Okay, so for these people in the rural places, for them to have sustainable livelihoods, they should be able to deal with shocks and stresses to their livelihoods. If, for example, there's an outbreak of locusts, how do they ensure that they are well diversified? Okay, how do they ensure that they've stockpiled food, for example, to make sure that they do not die within the short term or the medium term? See, so these are some of the issues that need to be looked at, and to make sure that livelihoods of people who actually depend so much on agriculture is sustainable. They do not just live on subsistence farming, but they can also look to export their products and therefore sustain their livelihoods. Now, with greater technological penetration in developing countries, where you now have cell phones are all over, internet connectivity is greatly advanced, with even fiber optics coming into play in recent years. We now have greater communication, greater information pertaining to things like healthcare, education, and even agricultural information. So at the click of a button, even the remotest places will be knowing about locust outbreaks. They'll be knowing about dangerous viruses. They'll be knowing about developments in the kind of seeds that you can use for the next season, and so on, which is a good thing, because people's livelihoods can be greatly improved. Okay. Now, you can now make a summary of what we have learned from the review of the literature on what people have done in order to come up with sustainable livelihoods as a whole. areas worldwide provide a range of functions central to sustainable development. However, we will find that they have largely been left out of development thinking and practice in the past. So in recent years, like I was saying, there has been greater focus on sustainable rural livelihoods where many people live. So you can, if you only plan for those in towns, then you bypass where the majority of people live, and that is in rural areas. There is also a growing recognition of the complex global challenges of sustainable development, and also the need to put greater emphasis on agriculture. As you know, and as I've said, agriculture can help in subsistence. People live through agriculture. However, of late now we've been seeing trends in major agribusiness. Okay, here you could be thinking about things like cocoa farmers in West Africa, for example, who do the farming. They have the trees, and then from there they harvest the beans, which are exported to Europe to make chocolates. And you know how expensive chocolate bars are. Then the question is, how much are these large companies buying these cocoa pods for at the farm price? Is there a very big gap between the final product, which is a chocolate bar, and the farm gate price? If the difference is so large, then the question is, why not try to make the difference smaller so that even the cocoa farmers can benefit and have cash? Also, there is need to understand now that non-farm economic activities in rural areas are growing, but agriculture will still remain important for the majority of rural households. So whereas we are trying to diversify, agriculture will continue to be very important, not only for subsistence, but even, like I was saying, for cash crops. And also, in recent years, there has been a debate about GMOs, which is genetically modified organisms, including plants, seeds, and so on. Are we now seeing a gene revolution and not a green revolution? That is the question. So some issues are raised, some of which are ethical, and there's still an ongoing debate out there in the literature. Finally, I give you an assignment, which is a graded assignment. The question is, while identifying the Millennium Development Goals and its indicators, critically discuss the role of women in promoting sustainable rural livelihoods. Thank you so much.